Yeah.
Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. The Buddha smiles again. 25 years ago, it smiled. Before that, it smiled in 1974 when it told the world that India did have the technology of nuclear weapons. When Buddha smiled again in 1998, India changed itself. To find out that story and a little more about that story, which actually happened under the watchful eyes of the world and not one soul coming to know about it, I have with me Dr. Manish Dabhade, who is the founder of Indian Futures, a global think tank, and of course, a professor of international relations and diplomacy at the JNU. Sir, first and foremost, thank you so much for taking out time to talk to us about this very interesting subject that I think saves India today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
What would you like to say to begin with, sir? We take these things as granted today. It's something that nuclear weapons we also have and stuff like that. For countries today which are on the receiving end of aggression, I think that feeling is something that they would want to have.
Absolutely. In fact, Adi, that's in fact should be as we look back at 1998. This is exactly what we should have in mind looking at the Russia-Ukraine war. Let's remind all the viewers that in fact in 1993, Ukraine, under international observation, agreed to renounce its nuclear weapons program, and it was a multilaterally signed agreement. And look at what is happening in Ukraine now. Nuclear power of, I mean, Russia is actually ravaging through Ukraine just because it decided to give up its option on nuclear weapons. And I think that is a key lesson, a key learning about the state of international relations and how it has been always. And in fact, that's exactly why. In fact, if you look at, since independence, in that sense, the importance of Pokhran 2 for India. If you look at, there are very few moments where, in fact, you see that the historical imagination, in the national imagination, where it is really a moment of celebration. And in fact, Pokhran 2 really ranks at the very top, other than obviously the 1971 victory vis-a-vis Pakistan, leading to the formation of independent Bangladesh. So I think that is the perspective I think we need to have, and of course we'll discuss more. But I think that is where we are.
It's interesting that you bring about the current geopolitics in the game because the rumor has it a lot of countries is sitting on the edge of acquiring nuclear weapons today are rethinking whether we should or we shouldn't, and that's voices that we hear in Japan, South Korea. We hear such voices, of course, very subtle voices in Taiwan. These are very interesting developments that are actually happening. Sir, tell us about this. One of the biggest things about this test was that nobody in the world knew about it. CIA satellites to CIA spies to the KGB to the Chinese MSS, and even our friend Pakistan did not know what was happening around. Uh, it's amazing that India as a country today is a powerful country, but in those days we were not as powerful, could pull off something like that under the gazeful eyes of the world without just even a bird coming to know about it. How did that happen? And tell us the story about the beginning of this game.
No, absolutely. In fact, let's also remember that India made its intent somewhat directly known to the world via its 1974 peaceful nuclear explosion. So, which was obviously, as I said, the first test at Pokhran 1, which is called popularly Pokhran 1. In fact, and that is exactly where you saw lots of the Indian nuclear program was under constant vigil, and India also faced a tremendous amount of, in fact, the non-proliferation regime was erected exactly to really target India in many ways in '74 after the '74 test, and. If you look at in fact, you rightly pointed out that no one really seemed to really catch or really were in that sense surprised, which is exactly in a way is surprising, because 1974 was in fact a demonstration of the Indian trajectory or the Indian direction. The point is that in fact CIA, with all its assets, with all its I mean, the state of technologies, the money which went into creating the CIA and the best intelligence service in the world, was caught napping. In fact, the entire, if you look at the history of the CIA and the so-called failures, other than 9/11, the Pokhran 2 test is seen, in fact, as one of the singular failures of the CIA. So that really, and in fact, Atal Bihari Vajpayee later in one of the conversations the with his American counterparts, in a lighter note, said that, why didn't you? I mean, rather than gathering all the satellites and everything, our manifesto had made it very clear that India is going to exercise its nuclear option. So it was not something bolt out of the blue. So this was very much in writing. So please take our manifesto seriously. It's not only for domestic consumption. You muted, Adi.
I'm sorry. That's the funny part of it. As a matter of fact, Mr. Vajpayee had mentioned that in a passing speech as well, about, I think, about 2 years before this incident as well, that India must do this for its own security and everything like that. So it's interesting that it was completely missed. Uh, they say that the orders were given right at the beginning of Mr. Vajpayee's term. He probably in the first 10 days came out and said this needs to be done. Uh, what was the whole ecosystem at that time? Were they ready? And one of the things I want to ask you is, because this cannot be an overnight affair, one also tends to realize that there has been a constant little development rights from 1974, no matter who was in power. And the integrity of the Prime Minister's office must be commended in that particular aspect, that in spite of the political chaos that we went through in the early 90s, this thing never came out.
Absolutely, I think, and in fact, I'll go, in fact, much earlier to, in fact, the formation of the Atomic Energy Commission, Department of Atomic Energy, way back in 1948. So just 1 year after our independence, Prime Minister Nehru decided to go on with the, obviously, with the nuclear, I mean, but civilian component of the program. But also gradually, even Pandit Nehru was in a sense very clear that okay, we are starting a civilian nuclear program, but we are not closing down permanently the weaponization part of it, and in fact that is what was the policy was, that keeping the nuclear option open. So in fact that was exactly the policy from 48 to 1998, that you actually had different prime ministers coming from different ideological sort of playgrounds, and actually in fact having that sort of consensus that at least keep the nuclear option open. The point was, in 1998 we were led our hand was forced due to multiple reasons, and we can come to that, what sort of reasons went into it. But you are absolutely right that every Indian prime minister, including in the coalition governments, and whatever we had, especially in the 96 to 98, with Narasimha Rao, we had a sort of minority government, and all these governments, in fact, have really pushed India closer and closer to the nuclear weapon capacity. But I mean, all credit to Prime Minister Vajpayee for really, giving that final push, that final dhakka, and to really make India as a overt nuclear weapon state.
Well, as a matter of fact, it's an amazing story, sir, that so many opposing prime ministers went through that office, and that file probably was on the table. They were each briefed about this particular program, but nobody uttered a single word of this entire thing. So, coming to the actual preparation and the orders when it went out, what happened after that? How did the whole machinery kind of come into place? Uh, was the test date pre-decided, or is it something that the scientists decided to kind of take it as it goes? I know BARC was involved, Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam was involved. They're all wearing these army fatigues and stuff like that. The photographs are all over the place. Tell us a little more about the beginning of the game when the orders were actually given, sir.
Yeah, this actually, in fact, as you pointed out earlier, that when Vajpayee came into office for the first time in '96, the short-lived 13-day government, explicit orders were given to, in fact, make preparations for conducting a test. But the government collapsed, and obviously then things the following prime ministers, in fact, were not in a position or didn't want to, in fact, exercise that testing option. But in 1998, immediately into first few weeks into his office, Prime Minister Vajpayee, and this is being widely reported now in different memoirs and different journalistic pieces by the key decision makers at that point of time, that Vajpayee called in Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, and in fact the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, Department of Atomic Energy, and with these limited really gave ahead the marching orders that we should be conducting test at the earliest possible date. In fact, that date really came to this first or second week of May, and preparations began in right earnest. Obviously, I mean, you have for example, J. Abdul Kalam going in the army fatigues, and other leading scientists, and again operating at nights. Using different names to reach the destinations, obviously the Pokhran range. So there was an elaborate deception, and it was, I mean, obviously known that the American satellites would be watching actively with a intense focus during the daytime, and in the night the direction would be on the other way. It would be difficult to knowing the technologies at that point of time to really notice during the night times, and also the wind, also the because it was a desert area. So knowing all that stuff, I think it really came out as a wonderful sort of deception exercise, and implemented to perfection by the scientists there, and also with the full military backing. And in fact, it was what you. I mean, I just can't imagine that they really went to the villagers in the Pokhran area, and in fact asked them, please, I mean, can you just vacate your homes for and move to other shelters for a couple of days. No word really came out of that, and they were so happy. They didn't ask any question that what is happening, but obviously knew that this is something which is happening in the national interest. So I think that's a very fascinating sort of story, and ultimately that and exactly at then you have at 3:45 p.m. on May 11th, Prime Minister Vajpayee walking out of his residence and making that very abrupt grand announcement, obviously to the surprise of uh, also Indians largely, but definitely the foreign audiences and the foreign different global leaders, that India had conducted three underground nuclear tests, and obviously mentioning what sort of tests they were, including a fusion device, and that's about it. A very terse statement, and no questions asked and nothing. So it was just a declaration which set the ball rolling in multiple ways.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the dinner table conversations during those days used to be amazing. That people were pretty shocked. Uh, One of the most interesting little details that a lot of people don't know about is that this particular team conducting the test was so small that even if the satellites picked it up, they would have said there's some small, 100, 200 people. What will they do with that? There's probably some small testing they're doing and this and that. And it just, so the planning that went across in terms of creating the deception, I find it to be absolutely amazing. And that's something that I think the countrymen should know and celebrate, that if we can do it once, we can do a whole lot of things, a whole lot of more times.
Absolutely, and in fact, it is such a interesting irony. And again, but again, obviously worth the celebration that India achieved independence, political independence in 1947. But exactly when we were celebrating, and that late 50 years of independence in 97. So in 1998, we conduct this nuclear test, which should in fact and which is actually seen as now as a strategic independence. I think that is such a very important achievement which we all have to keep in mind. In some ways, many would also say that India has now, with those tests, actually became a normal state, because we had those nuclear capacities, we had those all those technologies in place, but we really were not driven by which states are driven by, states foreign policy are driven by power, are driven by interest. And in fact we were keeping all that aside and sitting on it all these years. So that nuclear indecision, in fact, I think made India in that sense a very abnormal country. And with really the testing of nuclear weapons, India was now really out there saying that we are a normal state with a nuclear weapon state, and this is what we are heading. This is the direction which we are heading towards becoming what now, in fact, as Jaishankar calls a leading power. I think so, so that really set the stage for India to move in that direction in more ways than one.
I mean, it's quite a wonder that the policymakers in those days actually had the vision to see the factor that China is growing. You've got Pakistan, which is quite a rogue neighbor, uh, and then you had '99, which was Kargil. So there was of course that little thing that happened, and of course things were pretty bad in the early 2000s with regards to Kashmir and everything like that. Uh, there was that vision within the lawmakers saying that we need a certain protection with regards to our integrity of the country. And would you kind of agree today, in a place in world where influence and nationalism is considered to be a bad thing, uh, having this sort of a, for the lack of a better word, insurance policy ensures that you are able to do what you want to do for your country?
Absolutely, Adi. In fact, the test should be seen as in fact, and which I have also written about, is that they in fact challenged a global consensus which was emerging in the 90s, that it was really about the end of the atomic age, and that ultimately everything was really peaceful. It is now an ideal world. The Cold War enemy has disappeared, and so you had the indefinite, unconditional extension of the NPT in 1995. You had the CTBT out for signature. So I think that India was very clear, and the Indian leaders had a very clear vision to understand that this is utter nonsense, and we need to have an insurance policy in the form of nuclear weapons. So that is one part of the story. The other, again, interesting part of the story is, if you look at the 90s and even now, the debates are that ultimately, if you want to be a great power, you need to be an economic superpower. I think that was really a notion which is right in some ways, but India really chose via these tests to take a traditional route, and the traditional route for great power was, other than acquiring different trappings of a great power in terms of your military forces, your conventional forces. Nuclear weapons was also a very key component of that in fact instrumentalities of a great power, and the Indian leaders really chose in that sense to really barge into that nuclear club by conducting these tests, and we have been proven right. Look at, exactly. Ultimately, one of the reasons why India is that important player, and for example, in the Quad, look at the Quad, which is such a significant core the of responding to the China challenge in the Indo-Pacific. Other than the Americans, obviously, who is the other nuclear power? So it is obviously India. India is there because of its many other factors, but surely the status of India as a nuclear weapon state, I think, has played a very important role in India really, and in fact giving a ballast to this whole idea of Quad.
So, I mean, you mentioned something very interesting right now, is that the geopolitics of the world today is in a place where there is flux, and the only way you can actually keep yourself together is by having a certain stability. Uh, it's funny that one of the most destructive elements and one of the most destructive weapons in the world brings stability. There was a, which is what brings me to my next question with you, that vision then, combined with the then defense minister in those days, George Fernandez's statement that China is the real enemy, Pakistan is an adversary and a nuisance. Uh, I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he kind of meant. Uh, it's an amazing thing that we saw through that particular thing and we kind of prepared it. What I want to ask you is that how dominant do you think this nuclear question remains today with regards to his India's outlook to the world, and India's position in the world, sir?
No, in fact, that's a fantastic question, because what has happened is, in fact, post 1998 and the India's nuclear trajectory thereafter, both as a rising power and as a nuclear power. In fact, we now have an Indian model of a nuclear weapon state. I think, and it comprises, obviously, that we are unlike the Cold War period, where you have the Americans and the Soviet Union then looking at nuclear weapons and really piling up thousands of nuclear weapons and looking at them as war fighting instruments. I think India has really shunned that notion, and India has adopted rightly deterrence, and deterrence by punishment. So you have the no first use there, and then you have the second strike capacity capabilities, and India, in fact, chose a minimum credible deterrent. So I think that we have learned at the Cold War nuclear history and come up with solutions. So in that sense, that is a very unique Indian solution to this whole question of deterrence. And especially, I think that's very important in today's times. The other thing which India really gained over all these years, and looking back, of 25 years after 1998, that India is also now seen as a responsible nuclear weapon state. So unlike other states which have really, for example, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, then look at China, Taiwan. The equations now. Look at, for example, how Pakistan was seeing its nuclear weapons to really blackmail India, to really coerce India. So India is, in fact, has found solutions in its own unique ways, and I think that is a very important takeaway of these 25 years, that India is now better positioned to really take on the strategic challenges emanating from China, emanating from Pakistan. Obviously, the surgical strikes and the Balakot made it very clear that India has been calling, or and India has called the Pakistani nuclear bluff, which was, in fact, seen as the nuclear umbrella was seen as a very limiting factor in shaping Indian responses to Pakistan's continued cross-border terrorism. But I think that mindset has changed now, especially after 2014. But also in terms of the China challenge, India is also building up its capacities. Technology, you have the Agni 5. You have now the S4 SSBN being sort of indirectly put in place. So I think, and obviously acquiring Rafales and all that. So I think India is really coming up in a big way, and really looking at its strategic environment, and really actively responding to that. I think that's a really a good story. Obviously, challenges remain. Obviously, we should be doing more. No questions about that. But I think we are in a reasonably good, and again, a safe place now.
Oh, indeed, there's just no question about it. When you see what's happening around the world, one really wonders, where would we be? So you also deal damper in with a lot of geopolitics and international relations. Of course, I want to ask you, what is the role of a nuclear power and a country with nuclear weapons in today's day and age, with the kind of stuff which is happening in the world today, the polarization, the division of the world, the crisis, the breakdown of the unipolar movement of America? How do you think nuclear weapons kind of fit into this particular tandem? Because currently, what we see is the war in Ukraine and nuclear threats. Uh, but of course, this has to settle sometime. It will take 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, whatever. It will settle down sometime. How do you think the future of nuclear weapons sets in with today's geopolitics?
No, nuclear. We are living as a realist, any realist would argue, we are living in a state of anarchy, a state of self-help. And when we are living in a world of self-help, I think nuclear weapons are an ultimate guarantor of a state's security, or a state's independence or sovereignty in many ways. I think that's a fundamental point which we all need to understand. It is also that, again, exactly the Russia Ukraine experience. that I mean, Ukraine, just because Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, look at what is happening to Ukraine. The larger point also is about, in fact, India's strategic ambition, and I think that is where it is important that nuclear weapons do play a very important role in really supporting Indian ambition to be a leading power. Obviously, because of its size, because of its population, because of the growing economic capacity. And mind you, we are now the fifth largest economy in the world, and heading towards being the third largest very soon by the
Mm.
end of this
Mm.
decade, hopefully. So I think, in that sense, nuclear weapons really give you that unique sort of leverage and again, I mean, it is really about power, and it is really about influence. If you look around the world and look at the China challenge, how many states have actually showed the guts to respond to the Chinese challenge? Look at what is happening in Southeast Asia. Look at what is happening in, I mean, obviously South China Sea. So I think Indian, obviously, the conventional capacities are important, but somewhere in the calculus, nuclear weapons do play that. It is really about mind games. So in that sense, India, you really get that confidence as a nation, in terms of shaping your strategic responses to, no doubt, a very serious challenge which is emanating from China.
That's quite interesting. There is also a propensity in the world today to kind of, let me rephrase that. There is a propensity in the world to kind of forget the destructive value of the nuclear weapons. Uh, with Pokhran, of course, the test was underground. The Pakistanis also did the test underground. I think those were the last tests uh, after the whole, the whole series of tests the Americans and Russians conducted. Uh, there was an alleged test by the North Koreans, but people don't want to believe or not believe. I don't want to get into that argument. But have we forgotten the destructive value of these weapons? Not in India, I can say that, uh, you know, quite confidently. But has the world forgotten the destructive value of these weapons and what they carry? Because the kind of rhetoric, the nuclear rhetoric that we see today, how do you kind of put this into context with what we used to see in back in 1998 when India became a nuclear power?
No, I think there is a realization. It's not that there is no realization about the destructive capacity of the nuclear weapons. That's exactly why, in fact, Russians were saber rattling in the first place. That and exactly, and in fact, they have succeeded because NATO was deterred, and there are limits to what the Americans and what the Europeans can actually support Ukraine with. So they are just, I mean, doing it just enough so that Ukraine poses a challenge. But clearly, the restrictive capacity of atomic weapons, the ultimate terror weapon, in fact, in the hands of the nuclear halves, and here in the case of Russia, has in fact led to successfully deterred, as I said, NATO from, I mean, coming out in full support of Ukraine. So in that sense, there is an acute realization now, in fact, of the importance of nuclear weapons, from not just for, I mean, the neighbors which are surrounding. I mean, it can be China, it can be Russia. That, ultimately, what is the protection we have? So either it is going to be balancing using by the acquisition of nuclear weapons, and that's exactly what you said. That even South Korea, Japan are now really rethinking about, because ultimately, I mean, some I think someone said that it is going to be, I mean, it is Europe today, but it is going to be Asia tomorrow. So obviously, immediately, there is a linkage being drawn in contemporary geopolitics about what is happening. And again, there's a role of nuclear weapons out there in the European theater. So how is that going to play out very clearly in the case of China vis-a-vis Taiwan? I mean, I think that's a very important. So in that sense, and again, nuclear weapons. I mean, generally, I think it is really about power. It is really about ambition, and states who have, you don't have to. show that big stick always, even if you're carrying it, and that gives a sheer confidence, a strategic confidence in you. But also your rivals, your adversaries, your friends, they all know that you do have that big stick. So I think in that, you already have that element in your conversations, in your diplomacy, vis-a-vis different players in different contexts.
So, how did the nuclear weapons change India's perspective? Of course, we know that India went through a civil nuclear deal with the United States, and a lot of people may not agree with the kind of deal and the deal that we got, and this and that. And I don't want to get into that details, but the sheer factor that one of the largest nuclear powers in the world sat down and did a deal with you on nuclear weapons kind of made it clear that they accept the fact that you have nuclear weapons, and this is in 2000 and the late 2000s, when you have probably just about under 10 years of acquiring the nuclear capability. What do you think has changed in India's perspective or the world's perspective towards India after India becoming a nuclear power?
No, I think that's a very important point. Ultimately, what did 1998 test do for us? So I think very importantly, it really brought India as a serious challenger to the Chinese hegemony or the emerging hegemony at that point of time in the Asian theater. So I think that was realized very soon. That ultimately, look at, in fact, the 1990s. Obviously, with the Soviet Union gone, the look at the U.S. strategy reports, national security strategy reports, and all of them were really saying that China was emerging as a peer competitor, and who had that capacity and who had that willingness, in fact, to really emerge as a challenger to China, and it was really India. So in that sense, that really came on 90s, and in fact. The nuclear test of 1998 really came as a disguise, as a blessing in disguise for the Indo-US relations, because it made very clear that that US as the sole superpower then, it was important that as democratic countries, that they had to be aligned. And in fact, Vajpayee, in fact, for the first time coined the word natural allies, that India and US were natural allies. And in fact, the Jaswant Singh Stoked Albert talks, and later Brajesh Mishra also played a very important role, India's national security advisor then, in the conducting of tests themselves, but also post Pokhran to diplomacy. And India now really had, was completely unshackled from all the restraints, the moral restraints, the restraints which were imposed by countries which had really put in sanctions. And now that, okay, this is the reality of India as a nuclear weapon state, and this is what we intend to do, that we want to really closely align with the United States. And obviously those conversations really, in fact, sharpened India's understanding of itself and what India was looking in its engagements with the world. And also, the other sides, that you had the Americans, you had the French, you had even your nuclear rivals. Here obviously the Chinese and the Pakistanis. That ultimately, that this was an India which was different. This was an India which really kept its security imperatives, its interest, at the forefront, and now we have to deal with it. So in that sense, those sorts of calculus completely changed with the 1998 nuclear test, and India was now seen as much more realistic, much more driven. Yeah, and obviously, this was all related to your building of domestic capacities, and really looking out for peace and prosperity within the country, but also what sort of value systems India was trying to, come out externally. I think that really signaled to the entire world the 1998 test in big ways.
Oh, that's a very, very, very important point, sir. I think the I would say that the narrative of India started being listened to, and that's very important. So, lastly, I'd like you to let's leave the serious stuff aside. Let's you've done research on this. I'm sure you have a little anecdote or a story that you can tell us that is not widely known to people, so that people get a little more interested in this thing. Everybody takes it as a thing that, yeah, we've got nuclear weapons. Let's all learn a little more about this. Would there be a story that you can tell us that is, of course, not a secret, but not very well known about the people involved in this test.
No, I mean, very important, in fact, facet about the test and really what sort of conversations happened between US and India. Obviously, there's lots of stuff written about it, and I think there was I mean, a very good snippet and in fact, a key conclusion drawn from Jaswant Singh Stroke Talbot negotiations. So you have Stroke Talbot obviously developing that personal rapport. So in that sense, one of the key, I mean, lessons of diplomacy, which I also learned as a student earlier and as a teacher now, is that personal relationships matter, trust does matter, even you when you're dealing with rivals. And the conversations with which Jaswant Singh Stroke Talbot had, in fact, Jaswant Singh making it very clear that we are not going to give up nuclear. It's not going to be a rollback, cap, and freezing of our nuclear program. It is really that India is never going to renounce its. India is now a nuclear weapon state, and the Americans had really put up I mean, bilaterally and multilaterally, really put out a list of things which India had to do before relations had to be normalized. But at the end of those conversations, in fact, 2001, when George W. Bush came into power. By the end of that period, in fact, Stoke Talbot does make a very candid sort of conclusion that that I really failed in negotiating with India. The Americans failed, and in fact, Jaswant Singh was the one who actually reached near the goal we both had decided on will be reaching. But the Indians really, I mean, were out there, were very patient, and ultimately things did fall in place for the Indians. So he made it very clear, and in fact, please, I mean, that is where you should. I mean, Stoke Talbot's memoir, "Engaging India," is a fascinating read. That it really gives all the insider details about where they met, what sort of issues, what sort of vocabulary, political vocabulary, diplomatic vocabulary both sides were using. These are very extremely important and very relevant. In fact, gives very rich insights into the world of diplomacy, how states negotiate, how individuals build trust. I think that those are very important sort of indicators to understanding, in fact, the contemporary. I mean, for example, how should India deal with China? How the Americans should deal with China? So I think those sorts of very important snippets do come out. Reading such works and reading those conversations. So obviously, you have Jaswant Singh also coming out in his with his memoir and exactly saying the same things. So I think these are very important lessons for decision makers, for students of foreign policy and diplomacy, that how nations negotiate.
How nations negotiate and how nations behave. And that's something which is very, very interesting. So this has been a very nice conversation. I must say, we've talked about, one of the most dangerous things in the world in a very, very light-hearted way. And that's something which is very interesting to me and it's very amusing. But having said that, the sheer factor that India is a power that even a large country like China would think twice before, crossing a certain line, because it knows that the damage to itself would be unbearable. So that's something that I think, as a forethought, wherever it started from, back right after the time of independence, is something that needs to be recognized. It needs to be understood, and it needs to be appreciated. But for the time being, sir, my appreciation to you for taking out the time to actually talk to us. I do hope this is not a one-show relationship, and since you are into geopolitics and international relations, that's something that Def Talks does. I hope to have you more often on the show talking about what's happening with India and the rest of the world. Till then, sir, Jai Hind.
Thank you very much, Adi, for having me. It's a pleasure. It was a pleasure talking to you, and of course, I'm looking forward to more conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.